Hey friends, it's Rachel. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another monthly reading wrap-up where I share with you the books I read this past month. Once again, I thought that there would be an extra book for me to share with you guys this month, but this book took me way too long to read and so it's going to have to wait until next month's wrap-up. But let's begin with the first book in this trilogy, Legacy of Ash by Matthew Ward, which I read way back at the beginning of June. This book is the first in a trilogy. It's epic fantasy and can be best described as there are three warring factions. The Southshires, which are oppressed by the Republic of Tresia, and then the Hadari Empire wants to take over both the Southshires and all of Tresia. There are three main characters that you're introduced to. Victor Akadra, which is Tresia's champion. He is responsible for the death of Katya Trelan, which was a woman who led a failed rebellion 15 years ago to try to free the Southshires from the Republic. And then the other two main characters are Katya's two children, Jaziri and Celine. Jaziri wants only to fulfill his mother's legacy. He dreams of having a free Southshires, while Celine wants nothing more than to be free of her family name and her mother's legacy. But when the Hadari Empire invades, Jaziri and Celine are forced to consider allying themselves with Victor and the Republic, or else they may all be taken over by the Hadari Empire and then no one will be free. So it's basically the enemy of my enemy is my friend situation. This book was a conflicting read for me. I have an entire video dedicated solely to this if you want lots of detail, but it was a conflicting read for me. I really loved the first 3/4 of the book, because usually I'm not a fan of epic fantasy. I think that most epic fantasy goes too heavy into the world building and not heavily enough into characterization. I did not feel that that was the case here. There are a lot of characters in this book, but the book devotes time to all of them, and you get to know all of them, and even if you don't agree with the characters' actions, it's kind of hard to root for one over another even when they're pitted against each other because you understand their motivations and where they're coming from. The world building is incredibly vast and complex. My only complaint with that is that I wish it had done more. I wish the world building had been explained more. And you don't want to overwhelm your reader right off the bat with a bunch of information. You don't want to info dump on them. But I kept expecting as the story went on to be finally given more information, and I just never was. This book is over 750 pages long, and I felt that there was ample opportunity to reveal more information to the reader at any given time, and that just never happened. Particularly when it comes to the magic system and the various gods that are involved, I felt like there needed to be more information, and it was never really given. Another thing that I didn't like was there was a plot line that was thrown in the last fourth of the book. I really liked the story when it was the Hadari Empire versus the Tresian Republic. That was a conflict that I understood, and even if I didn't like the characters' motivations, I did understand why they were doing them. So I enjoyed the story while the Hadari were fighting Tresia. There was a battle scene that went on for like 60 pages, and it was never boring to read. The pacing was very good, it was exciting, and I really wanted to see what happened to the characters. I feel like I learned a lot about how to write battle scenes from this particular part of the book, but when that last plot line was thrown in the latter fourth of the book, I really didn't like it. I really didn't like the direction that it went, and so that was a little bit disappointing, and it ended up lessening my overall enjoyment of the book. There was a certain part where I thought, I really love this book, I would read it again despite its length, and I was tempted to get a copy of it and stick it on my shelf, which is the highest compliment I can pay a book, because that means I will reread it again. But that last fourth of the book changed my mind, and so you may feel differently. I'm sure other people did. I just particularly did not like the direction that this book went. However, I do encourage people to read Legacy of Ash because I think it is a good example of epic fantasy, and I am really curious to know what other people think of it. I don't think it's particularly popular. I've never met anybody who said that they've read it, so if you're looking for an epic fantasy story and you have not read this yet, I recommend the first book. Next we have Invisible Girl by Lisa Jewell. I had previously read The Night She Disappeared, also by Lisa Jewell, and I liked it. And I said that I would read another of her books, and of the books that she has out currently, this is the one that sounded the most interesting to me, so that is why I chose it. The premise of this book is that there are various main characters, one of which is named Owen. He is a teacher at a college, and he has recently lost his job due to allegations of sexual misconduct with students, and seeking advice online, he instead finds himself falling down rabbit holes into incel culture. Another of the main characters is Sapphire Maddox. She is a teenage girl who has gone missing, and Owen is the last person to see her alive. There is also Kate, who is Owen's neighbor across the street, and her husband Rowan, who is a child psychologist. Sapphire was a patient of Rowan's until he said that she was basically done with her treatment and he let her go, and she was not happy with that, so Sapphire has followed Rowan around ever since, and she has learned more about him and his family than she ever intended. I did not enjoy this book as much as The Night She Disappeared. I didn't think it was as realistic, and I didn't find any of the characters to be as relatable as some of the characters in The Night She Disappeared were. And that's mainly because the characters in Invisible Girl seemed flat and unrealistic to me. They all seemed a bit neurotic, and I got the feeling that they all suffered from some kind of mania, because none of their thought processes felt real to me. Kate is simply Rowan's wife. Sapphire is a troubled teen who for some reason can't bear the thought of staying under a roof. She has to go outside. I think that Owen is a character you're ultimately supposed to feel sorry for, but the book does its utmost to paint him in the most unflattering light possible. Again, this is a fast, entertaining thriller, but there's nothing particularly deep here. And I thought the end explanation as to who was ultimately guilty was not very satisfying. Next, we have Little Souls by Sandra. This book takes place in Colorado during the Spanish flu epidemic and focuses on two sisters, Helen, who is a nurse, and Ludi, who designs women's fashion advertisements in a department store. The two of them live together in a house which they have rented out to a family, a man, a wife, and their daughter, but the man is abusive. The wife ends up dying due to the flu, and that just leaves the man and his daughter. One day, Ludi comes home from work to find the man dead in the house with the daughter and Helen nearby, and Helen has an ice pick in her hands, and it's very clear that this man has been stabbed to death. And so in order to avoid her sister getting into trouble, they decide to hide the body by concealing it, passing it off as a flu victim. So they drag the body out into the street and leave it there with a note pinned to it that says influenza victim. Now, if you were like me, your initial reaction may be, that doesn't sound very realistic. If you stab a man to death, how on earth could you expect to pass this off as a flu victim death? But to be fair, it's not as unrealistic as it sounds. The fact that an ice pick was used and not a knife will play in their favor because ice picks make very small puncture wounds, whereas a knife would be more obvious. And if the flu was as bad as this book presents it, and I think that it was, you have people literally dropping dead in the street and the bodies just lay where they fall because no one wants to approach for fear of catching the flu themselves. So the bodies just sit there and wait for corpse wagons, basically, to come around and collect them. And the people who collect the bodies don't pay a great deal of attention to how this person died because naturally they just assume it's a flu death. So that is plausible. From the summary of this book, it markets itself as more of a murder mystery in that we know who killed this man, but we don't know if the sisters are going to be found out for what they did. However, that's not really accurate. This book is more about the bond between the two sisters, Helen and Ludi, and less about the murder mystery. In fact, when the murder happens, the plot actually goes downhill. The cops that are involved are pretty stupid and simplistic, and the way they talk is very caricature and cartoonish. This is something that I've encountered in books before, and I quite frankly don't understand why this happens, but it does. The cops don't do a very good job. They're not at all realistic characters, and the murder doesn't really add anything to the plot at all. It's also revealed that there are criminal characters involved in all of this who have ties to the murdered man. And the bootlegger criminal types are just also caricatures. They're really bad because they're bad, and the way that they talk really makes me cringe a little bit to read it. I did feel an instant connection with Ludi and Helen. I felt that their relationship was real and believable, and that's not something that happens very often. I don't usually feel that quickly, but I did with the two of them. This is a very sad book, and I wasn't expecting it to be as depressing as it is when I went in. There's also a lot of heavy-handed topics thrown in here, so if you are going to read this book, be aware that there are a lot of triggers. It basically felt like every bad traumatic thing that exists was just thrown into this book all together, and yet it didn't feel particularly dark or heavy because none of these heavy topics were explored beyond surface level. I also felt like the characters' relationships don't really evolve beyond surface level either. Even though I believe in their relationship at the beginning of the story, it doesn't feel as genuine as the story goes on because the characters don't really change, and they certainly don't get any deeper than they were at the beginning. It is clear that a lot of research was put into this book. There are lots of historical details, which I appreciate. This book is definitely best before the murder happens. After that, everything just gets really flat, and it's really trite. The way that the investigation unfolds unfolds is kind of absurd. And if I had to describe this book in just one word, I would say trite, because that's the way it came across. All in all, the story was very flat. There's nothing terribly memorable about it. And last but not least, we have American Eve. Evelyn Nesbit, Stanford White, The Birth of the It Girl and the Crime of the Century by Paula Uruburu. This is a nonfiction book that tells the life of Evelyn Nesbit, who was very popular in the early 1900s. She was considered an extremely beautiful young woman, and she was photographed quite a lot, and she also posed as a model for painters as well. Her life story starts out common enough. Her father was the breadwinner, he loved his daughter, he doted on her, he bought her books for her own personal library, and her life seemed pretty okay until her father died suddenly and her family was plunged into poverty. Her mother had skills as a seamstress, and she moved the family around after the father's death, trying to get work as a seamstress, but no one would accept her because she had no professional experience and she hadn't been to Paris, and they were like, oh well, you're not up to date on the latest fashions. So there was some serious elitist gatekeeping going on at the time with this sort of thing, so needless to say her mother could never find work. It wasn't until Evelyn was discovered by painters and photographers around the age of 14 that things began to change. Suddenly she was posing for photographers and painters, and she was the breadwinner. She was bringing in all of the money, and her mother wasn't sure that she liked this arrangement. It seemed slightly immoral. Like, what if these men want to take advantage of you? What kind of poses are they going to ask you to do? But for the most part, it was completely above board. And of course, with the money coming in, Evelyn's mother was hardly in a position to refuse. Fast forward to when the family moves to New York. This is where everybody wants to go to become a model or to go onto the stage, what with Broadway and all of that. Evelyn eventually attracts the attention of Stanford White, who was a very famous architect who basically made New York what it was at the time. She gets a role in a stage play, and one of the other actresses ends up introducing her to White, and he takes her to his personal apartment or whatever, and he treats her to all of this expensive, wonderful food that she doesn't have access to otherwise. There is a swing in his apartment that is very infamous. He has girls swing on it, and Evelyn eventually one day becomes known as the girl on the velvet swing because of this. Basically, White becomes the father figure that she lost. He dotes on her, he spoils her, he gives her all of these free gifts, and he's basically a paternal figure to her. He does not let her drink more than 1 glass of champagne until he does. One time when Evelyn is there visiting him, he plies her with champagne, way more than he's ever allowed her to have, and he shows her around the place where they are and all of these beautiful things he's collected, and basically, as a teenage girl, she is starstruck by the wealth that this guy has, and he's sharing it with her. Unfortunately, Evelyn either drinks so much alcohol that she ends up passing out, or it is possible that she was drugged. No one really knows for certain, but whatever the case, she ends up passing out while in Stanford White's company. They are alone together, obviously, and you can very well guess what ensues. Stanford White assaults her while she's unconscious, and then when Evelyn comes to and realizes what has happened, she is very obviously appalled by this and also confused and doesn't know what to make of it, because this person that she has viewed as a father figure this whole time has just taken advantage of her in the worst possible way. Anyway, Evelyn ends up becoming Stanford White's mistress for a time, and you might think, why would she do that after what he just did to her? But she is an impressionable teenage girl who is basically in awe of this man who is very powerful and influential and wealthy. So fast forward a little bit again, there are various men who have tried to worm their way into Evelyn's affections, but she basically brushes them all off until she encounters one that won't take no for an answer, and that is Harry Cathaw of Pittsburgh. At first he courts her without telling her who he really is, and then of course he does, and she doesn't really know a great deal about him because even though he has quite the reputation, his mother plays damage control. Every time he has done something bad in the past, the family has basically paid a lot of money to keep it quiet. In fact, the term playboy as we know it today is thought to have been coined because of Harry Cathaw of Pittsburgh. Harry decides that he really wants Evelyn and that she has somehow become corrupted because of Stanford White's influence. He hates White with a burning passion and wants to expose him for the corrupter of young girls that Harry believes that he is. And that he, well, is. Basically, Harry manages to wear Evelyn's defenses down, and she ends up having to have emergency surgery to have her appendix removed, and while she's recovering, Harry's like, we can go on a sea cruise to Europe. and you can get away from the hustle and bustle of New York City. And Evelyn and her mother are like, yeah, that's a great idea, so they decide to go with Harry on this cruise. While they're in Europe, various things ensue. Evelyn and her mother are at odds, and then her mother leaves her in Harry's company, and her mother goes back to the embassy, I believe in England, and she's going to file a kidnapping complaint against Harry. But in the meantime, she's left her daughter completely alone with this man, and as you can imagine, it doesn't go well. For a while, Harry is very solicitous and kind, but sooner or later his true narcissistic tendencies reveal themselves, and he too assaults Evelyn very violently one night because he previously coerced her into admitting what Stanford White did. He's very angry about this, and he uses that as an excuse for his own actions, that he was just upset at what Stanford White did. Strangely enough, despite what he did to her this night, Evelyn does eventually end up marrying Harry. Harry's mother doesn't like this arrangement because Evelyn comes from a poor family and basically has no money and no prestige attached to her name. But the marriage takes place anyway. And Harry treats Evelyn abominably. He never lets her forget the fact that Stanford White did this thing to her and somehow twists it to where it's her fault. It was the worst night of her life, and Harry just keeps bringing it up and never lets her forget it. Harry also does not forget his vendetta towards White. And so we get to the crime of the century. One evening, Harry and Evelyn are in the audience watching a show on a rooftop, which is the same stage where Evelyn once performed herself as a condition of their marriage. Harry refused to let Evelyn be on the stage anymore. So they're watching the show, and White arrives all of a sudden. And Harry basically walks up to White, pulls a gun out, and shoots him at point-blank range in front of hundreds of people. So there are lots of witnesses to the crime of the century. Needless to say, Stanford White obviously died, Harry went on trial for murder, and all of Evelyn's sordid secrets were dragged into the light. She was forced to take the stand and admit all of the sordid details of the things that have happened to her in order to try to save Harry from being executed for murdering White. Long story short, the trial actually ends up with a hung jury. They can't come to a conclusion, so they have to have a new trial, and Evelyn has to do it all over again. But ultimately it ends with Harry being found not guilty by reason of insanity, but he is then thrown into an asylum for several years. Evelyn's life after that is not a happy one. She had one son, which she claims is her son and Harry's son, and that he was conceived during a conjugal visit she had with Harry at the jail, but Harry refuses to acknowledge his son. He claims it's not his. So the day he died, he refused to acknowledge that this is his son. So who knows? Evelyn ended up divorcing Harry, and she married again, but that also ended in divorce. She never again really achieved the same level of fame that she had during her photography modeling days. She did star in a few movies, but ultimately she never really got any financial success. She was basically right back where she started, and she did attempt to kill herself at least once, and her life story is just really sad, and I don't know what to really make of it, but that's really her story. But there you have it. Those are the books I read in the month of June. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to leave a like, comment, and subscribe so you don't miss out on any future content. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!